Chapter 11 discusses American slavery. Um, every chapter is important, but this one is probably the most because the realities of slavery have, for many, many years, gone whitewashed. And what I mean by that is softened, decreased, um, uh, lessened to an extent to sort of perpetuate the myth of what a lot of people refer to as the lost cause of the Civil War, right? Um, so, what did American slavery look like, really? This chapter does a nice job of sort of introducing the topic. I want to expand upon this as one of my areas of research, one of my areas of quote unquote expertise that I've done a ton of work on, specifically slavery in the state of Kentucky. Um, I think it's a good way to start by just sort of saying this. Slavery was a dehumanizing institution that most of the American wealth during the antebellum period was built upon. Um, of course, the roughly 400,000 enslavers made massive amounts of money off of the labor of those whom were legally defined as their property. This is known as the chattel principle. But secondly, Northern industry also benefited from cheaper products being produced by the labor of the enslaved throughout the South. As a result, the American economy was built upon slavery, North and South. Um, everyone knew it, everyone agreed upon it, and it's only until we get to after the Civil War of this revisionist history that the war wasn't about slavery and slavery wasn't a bad thing. It's complete nonsense, and I'd use a different word if this wasn't a video that's for people of all ages. Slavery was a principle that was introduced to what would become the United States through an institution known as the Middle Passage. Now, the Middle Passage was this dehumanizing trade from Africa that would bring Africans to the quote unquote New World on these slave ships. And there they would be sold into the Caribbean and then into what would become the United States, the British North American colonies, as chattel, as property. Of course, this was something that was transitioned to for labor throughout the Southern colonies after Bacon's Rebellion, if you want to look at previous videos and previous chapters. But this became an institution that not only became a financial institution that was a boon to the United States, but also, and more importantly, a social hierarchical system that essentially created within the Southern United States European feudalism. At the top, you had the minority. And by the minority, I mean the smallest group, and this was the enslavers. Roughly 400,000 out of a population of Southern states that were about 8 million. The next rung you had was about 4 million people who were plain white folk. I would call them yeoman farmers. These would be your non-slave holding whites, right? Those who lived in the Appalachian Mountains, those who lived in the back country, those who were poorer whites, but they were not at the bottom of the social hierarchy because they were not black. At the bottom of this Southern feudalism, you had the enslaved, right? The other 4 million out of the roughly 8 million population of the 15 states that permitted slavery legally within their state borders prior to the Civil War and the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery once and for all. The interesting thing, questions that I often get about slavery outside of the institution itself is, well, if the vast majority of people in the South didn't own slaves, then why did they fight in the Civil War, right? And that's a great question. And that's one of the real things that the enslavers had to deal with when the Civil War began. And you see it throughout their documentation, their letters back and forth to each other and the Confederate government. They were very well aware that if they made this a war about keeping slavery, and that was the goal, that they would lose the support of the yeoman whites, the other 4 million that were going to fight their war for them, right? Because let's be realistic here. The enslavers ran the Confederate government. The enslavers were the generals in the Confederate government. And the overwhelming majority of those who fought for the Confederate Army were these yeoman whites who did not own slaves, did not benefit from slavery financially, but they did socially. They benefited because as poor as they were, as destitute as they weren't at the bottom of the social hierarchy in America. Their whiteness meant something, and they clung to it like you would cling to a raft in an open sea. And that's why we have the racial problems. That's why we still do have the racial problems in this nation today, is that white supremacy is something that mattered before the war, after the war, to decreasing numbers of people today, thankfully, but still to some people. And that's why they fought for the Southern way of life, the old South, Southern institutions, et cetera, right? I'll talk a lot more about this in coming chapter videos when we get closer to the Civil War, right? But what did slavery look like, right? It was a dehumanizing institution, as I stated previously, where the enslaved had zero rights. They could be beaten, they could be killed, and there were almost in every institution, every state throughout the Union, no legal ramifications. Now, Kentucky was unique. If you were accused of being overly abusive or excessive in your corporal punishment of your enslaved, you could be brought up on charges and forced to emancipate that slave. But really, what would happen is you would be forced to sell the enslaved person if you were found guilty of a all-white jury, and then you would be compensated and you would get the money for the sale of this enslaved person. Where's the downside of this for the enslaver? Where's the upside for the enslaved? They get sold to another person. So there was really no real ramifications there. What you have here is a thriving institution. But by the time the United States Civil War begins, there are 4 million enslaved people in the 15 slave states, as they were called, right? This was a thriving domestic slave trade where you saw essentially from Richmond to New Orleans, Richmond, Virginia, to New Orleans, Louisiana, to Charleston, South Carolina, and back, a triangular domestic slave trade from the upper South to the lower South to the Atlantic coast, where you saw 2 million human beings being transported and sold on the auction block to the highest bidder. This was the dehumanizing of the dehumanizing. You would be held in a slave pen. Prospective buyers for the weeks before the auction in New Orleans or Richmond or Charleston or anywhere in between could come and inspect you. And by inspect you, I mean inspect you like you would inspect livestock prior to an auction. Young girls would be sold into concubinage as sex slaves to these old white men. They were called fancies. They gained the highest amount on the auction block. Young black women who would be sold as fancies into a life of concubinage. The average, and these numbers vary, but the average sale of a young black man on the auction block who would become a worker in a field, either for cotton or tobacco or in these other cash crops, rice in the Piedmont in South Carolina, roughly $800. Inflation is not exact, but you're looking at the type of purchase that only the ultra elite could afford. Okay. These fancies, these young girls would go for a higher price, sometimes as much as double that, up to $1,500, $1,600. The other question I get is, if slavery was so horrible, then why did you not see more slave rebellions, more slave uprisings, right? Now, you did see some. There was Nat Turner's rebellion in Southampton, Virginia in 1831. There were other plots that were uncovered prior to their enactment, like the Gabriel's rebellion and Denmark Vesey conspiracy. But ultimately, the answer is this. As horrible as slavery was, there was a semblance of humanity and familial cohesion in the slave quarters on these plantations. I don't like to use the word plantation. I like to use the term slave labor camps, where at the end of the day, you would go back to your quarters. You would have a wife, you would have children, you would have cousins, you'd have family members. And for those brief moments, you'd have a semblance of humanity. If you disobeyed the overseer or the enslaver, you could be put, as one enslaved person once said that he was told by his owner, put in his pocket real quick. And what he meant by that is turned into cash. You could be sold. It was that easy. The unknown of being sold down to the deep south, to the sugar plantations of New Orleans, away from your family, away from your loved ones, perhaps even to a worse overseer or a worse enslaver, right? The what ifs, the unknowns would lead to a semblance of um, a unwillingness to rebel, an unwillingness to uprise or disobey orders, right? Um, what if you had a young daughter? You would do what you were told because of the fear that perhaps the retribution would be that she would be sold, and you knew what that meant, right? Um, how did the enslavers explain this system away, right? Now, the other question I get in class always is, how could the people in the North not know that slavery was wrong, right? Well, what had they been told? And they had never seen it. Again, go back to my chapter on how disconnected the United States was prior to the growth of roads and railroads and canals, right? Most Northerners, the vast majority of them, never saw a plantation. They never went to a slave auction. They never saw an overseer whipping or beating an enslaved man or woman, right? They never heard about fancies. So what they were told by the enslavers was that this was a paternalistic institution. This was the term paternalism, as that these were uncivilized beings that were incapable of liberty. And so, because they could not take care of themselves, this was a paternalistic institution where they were housed, fed, and clothed. And in many instances, Christianized, right? So this was an institution that was almost benevolent, right? And that was the party line of the enslavers. It was not always the party line of the enslavers. The initial founders, like Thomas Jefferson, who enslaved over 500 people throughout his life and engaged in sexual assault on enslaved women like Sally Hemings, who we now know that he fathered 5 children with due to DNA evidence, would say this is wrong. Jefferson said it's wrong, but I don't know what to do about it, and I don't want to get rid of it because I'm benefiting financially from it, right? But as you go into the second generation, the John C. Calhouns, the George Fitzhughs, the Jefferson Davises, the Alexander Stevenses, these guys clasp on to this paternalism. And they clasp onto this. It's not wrong. It's good. And so I'm not going to apologize for it. I'm going to actually look at you in the North and say, you have wage slaves, right? You have workers in factories that you don't even pay a living wage, and you send them on their way and say, good luck finding food and shelter, right? So this becomes the big push and the pull between the North and the South in the years leading up to the Civil War. But I think ultimately what you need to understand about American slavery is it was the worst institution perhaps ever instituted throughout the history of the world. It was racially codified. Enslavers obviously benefited from it, but also poor whites in the South benefited from it because they were not at the lowest rung of society. They were not in, as James Henry Hammond of South Carolina said, the mudsill.